I figured I couldn't just do a normal Torah study today. I had to do something relating to Purim because after all, that's what it is. And perhaps you have your box of Lucky Charms as well, who decided to put St. Patrick's Day and Purim on the same day. I don't know. I kind of wish I had a leprechaun hat or something. That'd be very appropriate today. But I'm just glad that we can kind of study a little bit of text together this morning. So what I wanted to do was look at really a small section from the book of Esther, actually, as a jumping off point to talk about God. Because as you might know, the book of Esther is a book that doesn't mention God exactly. Jay is showing the 0 over there, mentions God exactly 0 times in the entire text. And here is a book that an entire really important holiday is based around, and God is not mentioned once. And so we could ask, where is God in the book of Esther? Is God in the book of Esther? And I think that in some ways, this book of Esther really kind of speaks to, you know, like our experience today. So many things within the Torah, God is coming down and speaking with this voice and is trying to get a message to us. And it feels, you know, like the metaphor is good, but it's not necessarily in line with our day-to-day experience. And then here in the book of Esther, there's this kind of seeking for God, wondering exactly where God is, kind of struggling perhaps at times with our own theology. And that's where we're starting from today. So before we dive into our Torah study, let's join together in our bracha, in our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah Hafok ba, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yedidai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yedidai-dai-dai-dai. All right. So, if you remember, the book of Esther starts with the story about Vashti, and Vashti stood up to the king, and the king was not having any part of it. But where we're starting is right after that, when we're being introduced to Esther. Who would like to read this first verse over here?
I could do it.
Thank you, Irv. That'd be great.
And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maiden was of beautiful form and fair to look on. And when her father and mother were dead, Mordecai took her for his own daughter.
Okay, so just introducing us to Esther. And we see even from the very beginning, right? Esther is given 2 names as her being introduced to her. Hadassah, her Hebrew name, and then this funny named Esther that doesn't seem to really come from anywhere, at least within the Jewish tradition. Now, some of you were in our program for last night when we were talking through the Megillah. Marla is nodding. She knows where I'm going with this, right? So Hadassah is coming from the same word as Hadass, which means myrtle. If you remember on Sukkot, right? We wave that lulav around, and one of the things that we move around is the Hadass, the myrtle, which is a sign of fertility. Now, the name Esther, there's 2 different components to the name Esther. One of which, and a lot of scholars say, that Esther likely got her name from the goddess Ishtar, who was a goddess of fertility and sexuality and justice. And that was something that was being taken from the surrounding culture. But the other thing about the name Aster is that there is a Hebrew word, lahaster, which means to hide, to be hidden, or to hide oneself. And so if you write out the name Aster, obviously we hear the similarity, Aster and Esther, right? It's the same words. And so even Esther's name that she goes by within this text means that something is hidden. That's just kind of our starting point here. So if we look a little bit further to the Talmud, it asks, where is Aster indicated in the Torah? In the verse, and this comes from the book of Deuteronomy, I will surely hide, Aster, my face. So that already Aster is associated with this hiding. And the hide my face is referring to God, right? Asking, God, where are you hidden? Where are you? I can't see you. I want to connect with you. That's the context of what's going on there in Deuteronomy. So let's go a little bit further into our Megillah. Would anyone like to read this verse from chapter 5?
I'll read. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the entrance of the house.
Okay, so here we have Esther being dressed up, right? She's standing in the inner court. Esther has been picked as the queen, right? The king loved her above all of the others. She's in this really important position. And this verse actually, hold on one second. Yeah, let's look at the commentary from Megillah, from the Talmud, 4th century Talmud, on this verse here. It said, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house. Rabbi Levi said, when she reached the chamber of the idols, the divine presence left her. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Maybe you punish the inadvertent sin like the intentional one, or one done under compulsion like one done willingly. Or is it because I called him dog, as it says, deliver my soul from the sword, mine only one from the power of the dog? She straightway retracted and called him lion, she says, save me from the lion's mouth. So what's going on here? When Esther went into the kingdom, right, when Esther was brought in as a potential wife of the king, as the potential queen, what did she do? What was she doing in going into the kingdom?
She hid who she was.
Right. She was hiding who she was. And then what did she have to do if she was hiding who she was? If you're in a kingdom and everyone there isn't from your background and you're hiding your own background, then what do you have to do?
You're playing to the other background. You know,
Right.
You're playing a different role.
Yeah, so here she is. She's in an idolatrous place. And so she needs to be acting and to be worshiping in the ways that others are.
Just to bow down.
Well, I didn't know how many people she needed to bow down to because she was the queen, right? But essentially, that's what she's doing. In terms of faith, in terms of how she's living her life, she's not telling anyone that she's Jewish. She needs to blend in with everyone else. And so this text right here is saying that the divine presence left her when she went into the palace, when she became queen, when she started observing that. That's really, really hard there, isn't it?
What is the power of the dog?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly where that comes from, and I'm not recalling. I didn't mean to include that part of this from
Oh,
Megillah.
okay, erase.
Yeah, I'm sure there is a lot of meaning there, but it's not occurring to me exactly what it is. Unless, I mean, it's
That's just someone who is dyslexic wrote that program.
Oh, that's
right.
It's the power
It's
of
really
God.
supposed to be God. Yeah.
God, right.
Oh, all righty.
I don't think so. It's Kelev, but it's
I
a good
wonder
theory.
I wonder if it's saying is she could have not walked in. Did she have to walk into there? I can see where it would enhance whom she is pretending to be.
Mhm.
But I wonder if that's why God says, what? You know,
Yeah, did she
why are
actually
you
have to hide?
forsaking me? Yeah. Did she have to hide in the chamber of the idols? Was that a required entry into the inner part of the king's house?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions there, right? Like we had spoken about last night, that when they started looking for young virgins to come into the king's palace, the only words of advice that Mordecai gives her, not run away, not I'll hide you, not this is what you can do to make yourself look less attractive so that they won't bring you in. None of that. The only thing Mordecai says is, don't let anyone know that you're Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, it's really interesting here that, like, that's what's going on. And then to say that God is now hiding, God has now left her in a real way because of where she is. What does that really mean? Did that need to happen?
Did she take it too far?
And did God take it too far, right? We can extend it in both directions.
Well, yeah, you assume that God was present when Mordecai gave her this advice. But I mean, if we say God is everywhere and God is one, he must have been there.
Right. And the book of Esther, it is full of contradictions. There's contradictions all over the place. Just to like give some insight into what some of the contradictions are, the entire book of Esther is filled with a complete lack of order. Right? The way that things happen, everything is kind of turned on its head. It becomes topsy-turvy. Mordecai ends up being uplifted in the way that Haman had been, and Haman ends up being killed on the stake that he had erected for Mordecai. Like everything is kind of swapping back and forth all the time, right? For a book with disorder, it uses the word for order, Dean, in the book of Esther 22 times, which is unusual for such a small amount, right? So talking about order, but it's all filled with disarray and disorder. There's like so many different other little components to it. And here, you know, a book that is this holy book that inspired this really important holiday, a holiday that the Talmud says will be one of the only ones that will be celebrated after the Messianic age has been here, like has come. For a holiday like that to not mention God even one time, what's going on there? How can that even be possible? For God to have forsaken or to have left Esther, what's going on there? For Esther to be called by her non-Jewish name, what's going on there? That this story is about an assimilated people that has absolutely no desire to return to Israel. There's no longing. There's none of that within the text at all. What's going on there? So there's a lot of kind of curious things about this text.
You wonder why the whole book is even included.
And there's a lot of rabbis who were not so pleased. In fact, there were people up until the 4th century, there actually were people in the Great Assembly who refused to celebrate the holiday of Purim. Up until the 4th century, some really, really central people refused to celebrate the holiday at all for exactly those reasons. So it's fascinating. I want to take us to this verse in Deuteronomy that our last text was actually referencing. Would anyone like to read this small section here?
I would.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, because I like this one. The Lord said to Moses, You are soon to lie with your fathers. This people will thereupon go astray after the alien gods in their midst, in the land that they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them. Then my anger will flare up against them, and I will abandon them and hide my countenance from them. They shall be ready prey, and many evils and troubles shall befall them. And they shall say on that day, surely it is because our God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us. Yet I will keep my countenance hidden on that day because of all the evil they have done in turning to other gods.
So what do you make of these texts? What's going on here with the hiding of God's countenance?
Well, God, to me, God is always present, but he's going to not have the people know that he's present because of what all that they've done that is evil. I mean, but God is there, and God never disappears. But in a sense, but he's just hiding so that they don't know that God is there, or they don't recognize it because of what they've done. That's the way I see it. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Michael. Anyone else have any thoughts or comments on that?
Just adding on, not only what we have done, but what we have not done.
Can you say a little bit more about that, Rabbi Catherine?
Well, there are 600 and how many commandments, things that we should be doing. So it's actually not surprising that we wouldn't hit all those nails on the head. But some of those are unintentional and some of those are intentional. And however we rationalize or make the decision not to do something when we do have a choice. So there's the what you did do that, maybe you found your local idol and thought it was really cute and that you would bow down to it for the heck of it. Not a good idea. But when it's intentional, this I think emphasizes the intentionality of what you choose to do and not do, not what circumstances force upon you. Like you're in Shushan, not a really good idea to have to do things.
I want to maybe question even what I said, because few words before that which is in bold, hiding my countenance from them, it's written, then my anger will flare up and I will abandon them. So is it maybe God is not always present in certain things that we do?
It's really hard. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I didn't mean, but I'm just saying hiding from them. I just read right over that I will abandon them. So that is more serious, is it not? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
It's a very problematic verse, right? Because even when we make mistakes, we don't want God to abandon us, right? It's when we've made mistakes, it's when we need to rebuild that perhaps we need God the most, right? Like think about it with people in our own lives, right? It's when people need the most love and support that they tend to act in ways that are least desirable, let us say, right? Like when we're in pain, we sometimes respond to things in a way that we wouldn't if we weren't in so much pain. And so this idea that God is abandoning us when things aren't going right, that's really painful and difficult and theologically problematic.
Yeah.
When I read this, I keep on thinking for some reason of a parent whose really angry at their kid. They still love them, but they need a little time to adjust to what the child has done.
Mm.
And
So like taking a time out.
yeah, it's like they're taking their time out so they don't say something that they're going to regret. So it's not like they've forgotten entirely or they're just ignoring what happened. They're just trying to get back to where they want to be with the relationship. And maybe that's what the idea of keeping my countenance hidden, because when you have your countenance, it's sort of, to me, like your how you feel, how you are. And it's just another way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Any other comments on that? I see a lot of people nodding. Yeah, Irv, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm reading back at the beginning. It's, I think this is a term that's been used a lot now, crossing a red line. I think there is a red line here. If they cross and start getting other gods into the act, God isn't going to handle. I mean, that's not, it's one thing not going to stand for, as we know, from earlier chapters. But so that's what I'm reading, and he says, I'm prepared if they cross that red line, meaning my anger will flare up. If they do that, he doesn't say they have done it, or if they do that, and then I'm just going to withdraw. I think the author is making this more like a novel than, or a historical novel than something we would read straightforward. Thou shalt not.
Mm. Yeah. It very well could be the case. And I mean, I think that we're also right to keep pointing out this word hide, right? It's not that God actually isn't there.
Right.
It's that at times God is hidden.
Right.
And so, Jay, I love your way of looking at it a lot better than the way that I was putting forth. I like your way of looking at it, right? Because this idea that God is there, and sometimes we as human beings might move away from God, but God is always there to be found when we're ready for it.
I'm thinking of some of the stories that I've heard about the Holocaust, where you have a mother, usually it's the mother, but not always, and a child or children who can pass because they don't look Jewish. But that woman sometimes will tell the child, stay here. I'm thinking of one story in particular. Stay here, sit on this curb. I'm going to go and see if I can get food and come back to you, but you stay here. That it was, she had something in mind. That was her attempt to bring food. And this particular person who told the story obviously did survive. But think how frightening that would be if you were the child, or if you were an older person who could not survive for any length of time on your own.
It's really interesting. So what you're seeing here is that perhaps God is kind of going off to find a solution, that there's might be things behind the scenes that we simply aren't aware of.
Yeah. If you talk about God doesn't do the same thing all the time. The Torah is a great example of God doing things differently.
Always evolving, absolutely.
Right.
And even if we think about it in terms of like Shavuot, for example, when God is giving the Torah to Moses, Moses is gone just a little bit more than the people feel comfortable with. And what do? They turn to the golden calf because they feel like God isn't present and like Moses isn't present. And maybe he was all along. They just didn't see it. I can't see everyone. Did anyone else have something that they wanted to add to this?
When I look at this, I look at it from a parent perspective and a child perspective, tagging along with what Jay and Irv were sharing with us, because I think children oftentimes grow up because of how parents parent, that their parents are all knowing. And so it also teaches responsibility and also to learn to have a conscience. So if you break a family rule, whatever it might be, and you think your parents might not know about it. Some children are raised or they grow up believing, and my dad's going to find out anyway. My parents are going to find out anyhow about it or whatever. And you watch how kids try to get away with things when indeed their parents do know because they're so silly. They hear everything. And so that's what I'm thinking. How does God establish a relationship with these people? You know, amazingly, they did exactly what you said, Rabbi Cassi. When they had the chance, they went and made the golden calf. So it's constantly believing in something that you can't necessarily see, but it does exist, kind of like one's conscience. So that's how I see it.
Beautiful. Thank you for adding that, Marla. Am I missing anyone else? Okay, so let's go forward a little bit. Let's look at this text by Rabbi Turetsky. And he writes, one perspective is to view Hester Panim, meaning hiding the face of God. Panim means face, Hester is to hide, Aster, Hester, you can see that, right? As necessary in order to allow the punishment to occur. Rashi writes that God will make it as if he does not see their pain. According to Rashi, God is less distant than oblivious, pretending as if he does not see what is happening. Possibly working with this general orientation, the Or Chaim explains that if God were to make himself aware of the pains of the Jewish people, his mercy would prevail and he would not allow these events to occur. Apparently, Hester Panim allows tragedies, for God would stop them if he were aware of them. Chizkuni notes that the relationship between God's Hester Panim and the atrocities that follow, but views Hester Panim as a function of God's love for the Jewish people, not as a facilitator for the punishment to occur. Though the Jewish people need to be punished, God does not wish to witness it. Instead, he instructs others to carry it out away from his presence. A third view may emerge from Rashba. He argues that it is through the act of Hester Panim that God removes his special providence over the Jewish people, thereby leaving them susceptible to the hands of other forces. For Rashba, it appears that Hester Panim is what allows this unique form of punishment. For so long as God's providence is present and protecting the Jewish people, such an intense form of punishment is not possible. I know that's a lot of different commentaries and things being thrown at you, but essentially what it is this grappling with, why is it that bad things happen to good people? If God has the ability to stop bad things from happening, why wouldn't God do it? And I think that the kind of equivalent here would be like, let's say we have a child, a student, someone who's a kid, right, who makes a mistake. He needed to write this big paper and he ends up not handing it in, right? Now, as a parent, we might say, like, get on his case to get it done and everything so that he doesn't get a bad grade. But this is kind of walking away and allowing the punishment to occur so that the child could have a learning experience. And I'm kind of wondering, what's your response to this? What do you make of all of these different ideas here?
Well, other than, accidents of fate or whatever, we're supposed to have or identify with the presence of God within us so that when we can, we don't make mistakes which hurt ourselves or other people or society. But you know what happens in the world, either caused by mankind or just related to fate.
Or even randomness, right? Sometimes things that have no meaning just happen.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it might lend itself to, how personal you think God is involved in each person.
Mhm.
And maybe he just doesn't sweat the small stuff. But when it comes to picking another God, well, then he gets involved. The rest is just, let's let the world do what it does. We given you free will, and if you want to fight and kill each other, that's up to you. It's but if you decide, well, let's just move over here and start another cult with another idol, then he might get a little bit upset. That's again crossing a line.
Yeah. Although just to push back on that, Irv, right? It's
Yeah.
hard to say that something like the Holocaust or what's going on in Ukraine right now or what
Right.
happened in Rwanda, like there's so many different examples of
Right.
genocide and extreme violence.
Right.
You could make the argument, why was God not involved there?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So some of the way that the rabbis, some of the rabbis in here are dealing with it is by saying, well, God wasn't aware of what was going on. If God was aware, God would have done something. But since God wasn't aware, that's why nothing was done. What do you make of that argument?
That's nonsense in my mind. He either
Not
does
buying
or
it, huh?
he either does or he doesn't. I mean, if he's all knowing and all, omniscient, omnipresent, it's what level you believe. And something is like a big tragedy that's going on. You can't. To me, it just doesn't make sense to comprehend. It calls into question. And I've known survivors who've given up on God, and for that reason. And maybe they come back to it later in life. I didn't know them long enough, but it's hard. I have a problem with this whole book. We're telling a story of how people were saved by the action of a good person who took the steps and to do that and displace the bad person who was going to do us harm. To me, that's the whole kernel. Let's celebrate. Let's be happy that it happened. We boo the bad guy. It's like one of those melodramas. You root for the good guy and you boo the bad guy. But I really don't. I don't get excited about this whole book.
I mean, I think the celebration is actually, it's about resilience. It's about our ability, even in the face of overwhelming hatred, to be able to stand up to it, to be able to have courage and faith, even when God isn't present, and to be able to come together as a unified community to support one another through a bad time. And I think if we look at all of Jewish history, we look at how much we've been through as a community, or as a people, there's a lot of power in that. I mean, Purim itself, just to kind of give you some insight into where I'm coming from on all of this, my rabbinic thesis, everyone has to write a thesis at the end of seminary. And my thesis was how the traditions of Purim were used as a coping mechanism for people who were in and who were survivors of the Holocaust. And so for them, it was immensely helpful, powerful, and healing, both the story and all of the various kind of traditions that go along with it. And also, when I was a kid, there is a man in my congregation, a really wonderful man, who was a Holocaust survivor. And every single year, he would get up wearing prison clothing to chant the Megillah. And that is one of the most powerful things to see, to make it real, of here he was chanting the Megillah as a survivor. And if I didn't have an understanding of Purim before that, I certainly did after. Yeah, sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but I think there's a lot of power and meaning in all of this.
But Rabbi, is this where this concept of punishment, where over the last 70 plus years from the Holocaust, where people have said that the Holocaust happened because as a punishment for Jews. Did they get it maybe from this sort of text or whatever?
Yeah, and that's the theologically really problematic stuff.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of different things within the Torah, within various texts that say if something bad happened to you, it happened because you did something wrong. We know that that's not true, right? Bad things happen to wonderful people all of the time. And good things happen to people who perhaps don't so much deserve them, right? And so that's the theologically problematic piece of all of these teachings. And I don't believe that people in Ukraine are under what they're under because they deserved it. 100% not, right? I don't believe that people in the Holocaust deserved it for any reason. Of course not. But the bad things happen. And this is like the rabbis trying to make sense of it. What is it? What is it that I can do with this? I see hatred. I see suffering in the world. Where is God? How do I understand it? Well, maybe God's hidden. God's not there right now. When he comes back, he'll take care of it. That's one of the things that they're trying to say, that perhaps that's how we can understand it. For me, it's not so convincing. And it sounds like for some of you, it's not so convincing either. But then the question is, what is? How do we make sense? And that's a very personal theological question.
Yeah.
I don't hold God responsible for the Holocaust or Ukraine, if you will, right now. I hold God responsible in the minds of folks as they manage it. And that it's I do believe in the omniscience of God. And I think that I don't think it's God whose eyes are what do they say here, who are closed, or I don't remember what it was. I keep thinking that's what people do. I've noticed, like, sometimes when people are saying something of great either import or personal, they don't make eye contact. And I think they feel safer by not looking at that person who presumably is the listener. Or I particularly think when people are choosing to make a bad choice, I don't think they're connecting with other people. I don't think they may be looking out for the policeman chasing them, but they're not looking them in the eye. And I don't think, so I'm kind of twisting this around. I hate to say I don't agree with Rashi. He's really smart and whatever, but I just, humble myself and say, I just really don't agree with that.
I think Rashi would actually be quite fine with you disagreeing with him, Marla.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not holding God responsible for the actions of human beings who could have made a better choice.
And by the same token, when I'm thanking God, I feel that I'm focusing on something positive. And in the process, I'm acknowledging all the people who contributed to that good thing or whatever. I don't have that relationship with this omnipresent being. I think I feel it through people. I feel God through people in my relationships.
Beautiful. I was very Buber-esque of you. Buber had a very similar feeling, and that's a great person to agree with as well. I'm looking at the time. I'm just going to read this other text. This comes out of the Hartman Institute. If you aren't aware of the Hartman Institute for just in general, I encourage you to look them up. They have regular podcasts about Israel, but also about a number of different things that are truly academic, thoughtful, meaningful. I really encourage you to look into Hartman if you haven't already. But I want to read just the small piece by Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun. And he writes, if we had in our possession the Tanakh without the Megillah, we would know God only in every place and situation where God can be directly named. The Megillah comes to complement this deficit and to teach us that God is found secretly also in those places where God cannot be named. Here we encounter a deep issue connected with the culture of Persia. The Persian belief systems divides the world up into two realms, of good and of evil. that eternally battle with them. The Megillah comes to teach us that God directs the world even when God hides. God does not only direct the world of good, but also to those parts of the world where evil seems to rule and where at face value, there is no sign of God's presence. Aster teaches that God supervises the world even at a time where his face appears to be hidden from us, when we cannot discern God on the surface of things. In this way, Megillat Aster completes the Tanakh. It was deliberately written in such a radically secular style to teach us that divine providence exists in places and situations far from the realm of holiness, and that God's hand directs the world, even in places where God appears to be hidden.
This text really hit me in a really strong way, because there's a lot of times as a teacher where I get the kids will say to me, Mr. J, why do I need to learn some of these prayers when I'm not sure if I believe in God? And what I try to teach them is, if you read the prayers without God, it's really trying to teach you how to live your life. And again, it's, I think, the same story here in the Megillah, where we don't have God's name in it, but it's really teaching us, okay, this is how we're supposed to live our lives. We're supposed to not be afraid to stand up for who we are and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the other question there, Jay, is who is the God you do or don't believe in? Like, what does that even mean to not believe in God, right? Like this is kind of like pushing all of that and trying to kind of question, well, we use this word God. It's kind of hard to relate to the God of the Tanakh sometimes, but what does that actually mean? And the book of Esther, I think, opens that up a little bit.
Rabbi, there are other Megillot, right? Not just this one.
Yeah, I mean, there's other scrolls that we read at different times during the year, certainly.
But isn't it something that the word Megillah seems to become part of the Anglican word? I mean, not non-Jews use it just as well as Jews do.
Right, the whole Megillah,
Whole
exactly.
Megillah, right? Yeah, very commonly used.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do we want to look at one more text here? Are we ready to do that? Okay, so let's look. Sorry. I wasn't sure if someone was saying something. Professor Michael Fox, also from the Hartman Institute, wrote this piece. God in Esther is indeed veiled. As the popular metaphor puts it, a veil suggests that there is something behind it and invites us to look through. But when we look through this one, we do not see the sturdy old faith that so many readers assume must be back there somewhere. We see a light, but it shimmers. This carefully crafted ambivalence is best explained as an attempt to convey uncertainty about God's role in history. There is a reason that the author of Esther has not made God a more prominent actor in this story and has drawn God, if at all, below the surface of the story with just a hint of presence. The author is not quite certain about God's roles in these events. Are you? And does not conceal that uncertainty. By refusing to exclude that possibility, that God is indeed in control behind the scenes and directing the action, the author conveys his belief that there can be no definitive knowledge of the workings of God's hand in history. Not even a wonderful deliverance can prove that God was directing events, nor could threat and disaster prove God's absence. I went on a little bit more. I forgot about that. The story's ambivalence conveys the message that Jews should not lose faith if they too are uncertain about where God is in a crisis. Since it is impossible to know for sure whether God is present, you should never discount the possibility, even when things look very bleak, as they did for the Jews of Persia in the story. Israel will survive. That is the author's faith. But how this will happen, he does not know. Events are ambiguous, and God's activity cannot be directly read out of them, yet they are not random. The author might not be sure what to believe, but he is sure that there is some kind of pattern in the world and that things such as the events of the Megillah have not happened for no reason at all. When we search carefully the text of Esther for traces of God's activity, we are doing what the author made us do. The author would have us probe the events that we witness in our lives at the same time, in the same way. He is teaching the theology of possibility, right? And we know the quote from Einstein that, there's no such thing as a coincidence, right? It was just God, forget the exact wording of it. Perhaps one of you can help me, but it's like God that's behind it, right?
Oh, it's God's way of staying anonymous.
It's God's way of staying anonymous. That's Einstein's quote. Thank you. That's exactly right. So we see that here with the theology of possibility. Okay, there's only a couple more things I put in here. Why don't we look at them quickly? And then I can close this down and we could just be, in conversation with one another about it. So this is Rabbi Shimshon Pincus saying none of the names of God are mentioned in Megillat Esther, since if his name would be written explicitly, this would constitute a departure from the natural into the supernatural, which is applicable to Passover. Purim, however, reveals that each aspect within nature is imbued with the love of God. Where does one find more intense love? In Passover or in Purim? On Passover, God raised us over the entire world, but on Purim, we discover God in every nook and cranny of the natural world. So I'm kind of curious, just pausing here, what do we find the most compelling? What do we find that we connect with more? The God of Passover or the God of Purim?
I think I connect more with the God of Passover than in Purim, because taking us out of slavery and leading us to the promised land is clearer and easier for me to understand and relate to.
Mm-hmm.
Purim is,
it's wonky, yeah.
Questionable.
I want to take a little different approach.
Yeah, please.
Part of me thinks it's a little easier to follow the story of Esther, that it's a little more easier to picture yourself in that situation than in the story of Passover, where there's a lot of things that are very miraculous. And I'm not saying I'm either side. I think they're both very important. They're two of my favorite holidays. But I think the story of Passover, I think for some people is a little harder to believe. Whereas, I know especially I'm thinking of the story of the Red Sea parting and things like that. But the story of Purim, we see it all the time, where people have to stand up and fight for survival. We're seeing it right now in Ukraine.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jay.
So that's kind of like, I think God's in both places because of a person's will to survive. What a risk to take to put your first step into that opportunity when the Red Sea parted, to believe it would stay parted so you could get across. That's you got to believe. And then in Purim, you have to believe, to be responsible, to say, I'm going to stand up. I'm not going to do these things, that whatever it was, be naked or whatever they were doing. And I am going to be proud that I'm a Jew. So I feel like I learned today and last night, I learned of God's presence in Purim. I think I already knew of God's presence in Passover. I think I got that, or I knew that already, but I didn't ever put two and two together here with Purim. And now I feel like I have. I feel God's presence in the things that we do and we're reflecting upon.
Thank you so much, Marla. And I think these are deep questions, right? They require some contemplation. So I appreciate everyone's thoughtfulness around them. I want to bring in just one last thing. I mean, of course, there is the short thing that I've always loved of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, who says, "Where is God? Wherever you let God in." Right? I just think that that's such a beautiful sentiment right there. But I want to also bring in this piece from Naomi Levy's book, Einstein and the Rabbi. And if you haven't read this book, I highly, highly, highly recommend reading it. It is absolutely beautiful from start to finish. But in it, Rabbi Levy puts this piece in memory of Rabbi Harold Schulweis. When God was creating the world, God shared a secret with the angels. Human beings will be created in the image of God. The angels were jealous and outraged. Why should humans be entrusted with such a precious gift when they were flawed mortals? Surely, if humans found out their true power, they will abuse it. If humans discover that they are created in God's very image, they will learn to surpass us. So the angels decided to steal God's image. Now that the divine image was in the angels' hands, they needed to pick a place to hide it so that man would never find it. They held a meeting and brainstormed. The angel Gabriel suggested that they hide God's image at the top of the highest mountain peak. The other angels objected, saying, "One day humans will learn to climb and they will find it there." The angel Michael said, "Let us hide it at the bottom of the sea." "No," the other angels chimed in, "humans will find a way to dive into the bottom of the sea and they'll find it there." One by one, the angels suggested hiding places, but they were all rejected. And then Uriel, the wisest angel of all, stepped forward and said, "I know a place where man will never look for it." So the angels hid the presence of the precious holy image of God deep within the human soul.
Beautiful.
Isn't that just beautiful?
Beautiful. Yeah.
So I'm going to pause there just to look at your beautiful faces. Any kind of reflections or thoughts on all of this? I know this is such a deep theological conversation. Anything come to mind, whether a reaction to one of the texts that we just looked through or whatever's going through your mind at this moment?
I've always thought about the partnership between God and people. And it's very difficult to know who is the prime mover all the time. Does God move without us? Do we move without God? These are tough questions. But if you keep in mind that there's a partner with you, that really helps in just living life. But to know who's in charge is kind of difficult.
So many questions we have. Those are deep questions, Larry. Thank you.
Right.
I left you all speechless, huh?
Yes. Yes.
What do you make of that last idea that God is hidden within the human soul because human beings might not actually look there? What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's what it's all about. God within you. It's part of Jeremiah's thought. I write a new covenant in my heart. No, it's what it's all about. The God within you. Absolutely. You can call it the soul, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
I think it's to look deep inside yourself is really humbling, and that's something that's really hard for humans to do. Is to be really humble yourself before Hashem and be like, I know I have character defects. I know I have things. I want to fix those things, but I have to be real and be humble. And I think that's the way to really. And that's so I think it's right. It's how do you hide it from a human being? Because we don't like being humble a lot. We have a lot of ego issues. So I do anyway.
Yeah, and engaging in Musar this year, going through the Torah through the lens of Musar, that's really, really hard. And it's also really rewarding, I think, too. Thank you, Frank.
My yeshiva days, it was always the questions, not the answers. We got very few answers, but the questions what we struggled with.
Absolutely. And that's why Larry's was such a good question. But I don't know that any of us have an answer to it, right? We just have to keep kind of struggling with those questions. It's so important.
Keep moving forward, plugging away. And know that you have that connection within your heart is beautiful. Man in search of God, God in search of man.
Yeah, I know. I didn't bring any Heschel into this Torah study, but Heschel certainly would be appropriate in this context because he spoke so much about that connection, right? Through those two books and also in many other ways. And I mean, I think ultimately the message of this Torah study, the message that we're getting from the story of Purim is that perhaps God is in places that we're simply not looking. And if we allow ourselves to be open enough to recognize God, then perhaps we won't feel so alone when things are hard. Perhaps we can feel connected to something bigger. And perhaps if we can also see that divine spark in our fellow human being in any context, in any place, it really can kind of help us and guide us in how we interact with that human being.
And Franklin said, those are the ones who survived.
You know, Rabbi, I was going to say that what's funny is with St. Patrick's Day upon us too. I don't know, some of you know this, maybe some of you don't know this, but corned beef and cabbage is the big meal for the Irish to eat. And it's because the Jews fed it to them when they were here and they were poor and they had no other food. And that became an American tradition. I was saying, because Irish people never ate corned beef and cabbage. It's only an American Irish tradition on St. Patrick's Day because that's who fed them when they got here.
Oh, so interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. That's a true story.
Huh. Perhaps God was present there too.
He absolutely was. He was helping starving people. And it was us feeding.
I think there's a famous mayor of Dublin who was Jewish. Kind of like an oxymoron.
I don't know. Well, that's wonderful. I want to thank you all so much. I know that this was a very deep Torah study for a holiday that is all about putting on costumes and drinking and having a good time, right? But I think we need the balance of both of those things because it is deep and theological, and it's also uplifting and reminds us of how much strength we have of God's presence all around us and in us. And I look forward to being able to celebrate with all of you at our big party that's going on Saturday night so we can continue all of our Purim festivities. And in the meantime, tomorrow night, where we get to celebrate the anniversary of the first bat mitzvah 100 years ago. Pretty amazing. So I'm just looking forward to lots of celebrations in the few days ahead.
Everyone
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Say hello to my daughter, Jocelyn.
Hi,
Hello.
Jeffrey.
So glad you can join
Hi
us.
there, Sandy. Hello. And Michael, I see you there as well. Good to see
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. See you next week,
Bye-bye.
if not before.
That was a particular